St. Barnabas Church crouched at the edge of Little Witchcombe, flint walls damp with February mist and yew trees standing like watchmen. Villagers arrived in sensible shoes and dark coats, faces arranged for a funeral, solemn on the surface, alert underneath. Mrs. Adela Wincroft had been one of their own for 37 years, charitable, orderly, and quietly certain other people might try harder. The coffin rested before the chancel, polished oak reflecting candlelight. Above it, Adela's photograph looked down, a narrow face, a neat hat, eyes that seemed to tally the world and find it wanting. The vicar read familiar words. Breath clouded in the cold nave. Grief and curiosity mingled. In the third pew sat Miss Jane Marple, small and composed, hands folded over a handbag. She looked like an elderly sparrow, harmless, tidy, uneasily overlooked. Her mild blue eyes drifted from the coffin to the living, resting on Mr. Lionel Wincroft, who kept twisting his hat brim as though it were a stubborn jar lid. Near him, Miss Emmeline Harrow sat straight, Adela's companion and, in the village's imagination, either a saint or a schemer. Her lips were pressed together as if she feared a word might escape. Dr. Pritchard, young enough to be many people's son, stared at the wreaths with an intensity that suggested he had not slept. Mrs. Finch, who never missed a scandal, leaned sideways to whisper, then remembered where she was and folded her hands too quickly. After the final amen, they moved out into the churchyard. The air smelled of wet earth and ivy. A robin hopped near the fresh grave, brisk. The coffin was lowered. Soil thudded softly. The village, having performed its duty, began to reach, almost unconsciously, for the next comfort. Tea, sandwiches, and an afternoon of theories. They had nearly finished when Mr. Wincroft cleared his throat. It was an awkward, dry sound, not quite grief and not quite fear. He held a folded paper between trembling fingers. "There is a message," he said. Adela left it. She insisted it be read today. Here. A ripple ran through the mourners. Messages were meant to be gentle things. This, judging by Mr. Wincroft's color, was something else. The vicar hesitated. Constable Hargreaves, present out of respect and habit, watched the paper as if it might suddenly become evidence. Miss Harrow went so still she might have been carved from stone. Miss Marple watched Mr. Wincroft's hands. They did not shake like hands that had merely buried a wife, so they shook like hands that had opened a cupboard and found it full of snakes. Mr. Wincroft unfolded the page. His eyes skimmed it once, and the last of his composure slipped away. Still, he began to read, perhaps because Adela had always been a woman who got her own way, even from beyond the grave. "My dear friends," the letter said, in Adela's precise, slanted hand, "if you are hearing this, it is because I am dead, and you are standing in the cold with your collars turned up. I can picture you very well." A few people smiled reflexively, then stopped. The voice on the page felt too alive. "I've tried to do what is proper," Adela wrote. "There is a thing I have carried for years, and I will not carry it any longer. The dead should not keep accounts." Mrs. Finch's eyes widened. Someone gave a small, excited inhale. The vicar's face tightened, sensing the shape of trouble. "There is a confession I must make," Adela continued. "It is not for Mr. Wincroft to soften, nor for the vicar to excuse. I did it. I did it knowingly. I intended the consequences." Silence dropped over the graveyard as neatly as a shawl. Even the robin paused. "What did she do?" a voice whispered. "You will have your theories," Adela's letter went on. "You will say I meant well, or that I was misled. Please do not. I knew exactly what I was doing. I chose it, and I chose it again." Miss Harrow's breath caught, sharp as a snapped thread. Dr. Pritchard's head turned, quick as a bird's, toward the row of older graves. Mr. Wincroft faltered, then forced himself on. Sweat shone at his temples despite the cold. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Adela wrote. "So a tidy death allows a tidy lies. Mine will not." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed by the smallest fraction. Tidy deaths. Adela's had not felt tidy at all if one remembered last Tuesday's suddenness and the untouched second cup of tea. "In the drawer of my escritoire," the letter concluded, "you will find what you need to understand. Look not at what is missing, but at who is most relieved." The paper sagged in Mr. Wincroft's hands. For a moment, no one moved. Then voices rose, questions, exclamations, a hissed, "This is disgraceful," and an eager, "Did you hear that?" Miss Marple remained very still, the picture of gentle shock. Only her mind moved, quietly placing Adela's words beside the villagers' faces. Miss Harrow's rigid calm, Dr. Pritchard's sudden attention, Mr. Wincroft's trembling hands. Confessions, Miss Marple reflected, were rarely what they seemed, and no one confessed at her own funeral unless someone else had made it necessary. The murmur in the churchyard swelled and broke like a restless tide. People drew closer to one another, not from comfort but from instinct, the desire to speculate in safety. Constable Hargreaves stepped forward with a firmness that suggested he had been waiting his whole life for something precisely this dramatic. "I think," he said, clearing his throat, "that we shall all proceed to Mrs. Wincroft's house in an orderly fashion. If there is a drawer to be examined, it will be examined properly." The vicar nodded, grateful for direction. Mr. Wincroft looked as though he might refuse, but his protest dissolved beneath the weight of curious eyes. Miss Harrow moved at once to his side. "Lionel," she murmured, not low enough to sound compassionate, though her fingers tightened sharply on his sleeve. "We mustn't make a spectacle." Dr. Pritchard lingered by the grave a moment longer than necessary, staring at the mound of earth. Then he followed, his expression carefully arranged into professional concern. Miss Marple allowed herself to be swept along at the rear of the procession. The path from churchyard to Wincroft House curved past frost-bitten hedges and neat cottages. The village had not felt so animated in years. Even the sky seemed to press lower, as though eager to listen. Wincroft House stood square and respectable, its brass knocker polished to a dutiful gleam. Inside, the air retained the faint scent of lavender and beeswax. Everything appeared as Adela had left it, precise, controlled, unyielding. Constable Hargreaves removed his helmet with solemnity. "The escritoire, Mr. Wincroft?" "In the morning room," Lionel answered hoarsely. They filed in. The escritoire stood against the far wall, a mahogany piece with tidy pigeonholes and a locked central drawer. Miss Harrow moved toward it instinctively. "The key," she said, glancing at Lionel. "You know where she kept it." Lionel hesitated. "She wore it. On a chain." A small silence followed. The implications settled heavily. The chain had been removed at the undertaker's, its contents catalogued and returned to the house. "It is upstairs," Miss Harrow said quickly. "I placed it in her jewelry case." Constable Hargreaves insisted on retrieving it himself. The room waited in taut stillness. Mrs. Finch's eyes roved eagerly over every ornament, as though guilt might leave visible fingerprints. Miss Marple, meanwhile, examined the escritoire from her seat by the window. She noted the faint scratch near the keyhole, not fresh but not old enough to be ignored. She also observed that one pigeonhole was emptier than the others, a rectangle of lighter wood marking where papers had recently rested. Constable Hargreaves returned and fitted the key. The drawer opened with a soft, reluctant sigh. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with green ribbon, a small ledger, and a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To whom it concerns." "There," whispered Mrs. Finch triumphantly, as though she herself had arranged the evidence. Hargreaves lifted the envelope and broke the seal. The paper within crackled loudly in the hushed room. "I have already confessed," Adela's handwriting declared. "Mum, but confession without clarity is cruelty. You will find in the ledger a record of payments made over 6 years. They were not charitable donations, though they were made in the name of mercy." Dr. Pritchard stiffened. "The recipient will recognize them. So will the one who first suggested such mercy was necessary." A faint sound escaped Miss Harrow, barely audible, yet sharp as a pin-prick. Hargreaves opened the ledger. Columns of dates and amounts marched neatly down each page. The sums were regular, deliberate. "Payments to whom?" he asked. Lionel leaned closer, face pale. "There are initials," he muttered. "E.H." All eyes turned, slowly and almost unwillingly, toward Emmeline Harrow. Her composure did not shatter. It tightened. "E.H. could mean any number of things," she said evenly. "Eleanor Hughes, Edward Hemsley. As this is absurd." The constable examined the next page. "And here, L.W." Lionel recoiled as if struck. "That proves nothing," Miss Harrow said sharply. "Adela was methodical. She may have recorded household transfers." Miss Marple's gaze drifted from the ledger to Miss Harrow's hands. They were clasped neatly, but the knuckles had whitened. Not with fear, Miss Marple thought, but with calculation. 6 years is a long time, Dr. Pritchard observed carefully. If Mrs. Wingcroft believed she had committed some wrong, why continue it so long? "A sense of duty," Miss Harrow replied swiftly. "Adela was ruled by it." "Or by guilt," murmured Mrs. Finch, unable to resist. Constable Hargreaves turned another page. A final entry stood alone, dated 3 days before Adela's death. The amount was larger, considerably larger. "That was Tuesday," Lionel whispered. "The day she—" He could not finish. Miss Marple folded her gloved hands. Tuesday had indeed been abrupt. Adela had taken tea at 4, complained of a slight dizziness, and by 6 was gone. Dr. Pritchard attributing it to heart failure. Natural, swift, regrettable. But tidy deaths allowed tidy lies. "What was in this drawer before?" Miss Marple asked gently, as though in idle curiosity. Lionel blinked at her. "Nothing of consequence. Household papers." "There was a packet of correspondence," Miss Harrow said before he could continue. "I sorted it myself last month." Miss Marple nodded mildly. "How fortunate you are so efficient, Miss Harrow. Papers have a way of wandering when one is not attentive." The faintest flush rose along Miss Harrow's cheekbones. The Constable Hargreaves gathered the letters tied in green ribbon. "These may clarify matters." He untied the ribbon. The first letter slid free. It was not in Adela's hand. The signature at the bottom read only E. A stillness deeper than the earlier silence settled over the room. Miss Marple felt the pieces shift, not yet aligning but moving toward a pattern. Payments, initials, a confession written with theatrical precision, and a final, larger sum 3 days before a conveniently natural death. Outside, the village pressed nearer to the windows, hungry for resolution. Inside, the air had grown tight with suspicion. "Constable," Miss Marple said softly, "I wonder if we might inquire who, exactly, feels most relieved." Constable Hargreaves cleared his throat, the question lingering in the air like wood smoke. "Relieved, Miss Marple?" She smiled with faint apology. "Oh, I dare say it is an uncharitable word. But when a long strain ends, even grief can carry a trace of ease. Human nature is so very consistent." No one answered at once. The silence itself felt accusatory. Hargreaves unfolded the first of the green ribbon letters. The handwriting was bold, impatient. "You assured me it would be handled discreetly. I cannot endure further delay. The arrangement was your suggestion, not mine." No signature beyond the single initial. E. Miss Harrow's chin lifted almost imperceptibly. Anyone could have written that. Perhaps, said Hargreaves. "Let us see the date." He scanned the page. March, 6 years ago. Dr. Pritchard shifted where he stood. 6 years is precisely when Mrs. Wincroft's sister died, he said slowly. "The accident at the quarry." Lionel gave a start. "That was ruled accidental." "Yes," Dr. Pritchard agreed, perhaps too quickly. "Quite accidental." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, though she saw nothing of the garden beyond. Accidents were curious things. They rarely occurred in isolation. They sprouted from soil long prepared. Hargreaves opened another letter. "You promised the payments would cease once the situation was resolved. I cannot continue under this shadow. Increase the amount, or I shall be forced to speak." The room tightened perceptibly. "Blackmail," Mrs. Finch breathed, delighted horror warring in her expression. Lionel's face had drained of color. "Adela never told me?" "Adela rarely told you anything inconvenient," Miss Harrow said coolly, though her composure now had a brittle edge. Miss Marple noted the choice of word. Inconvenient. Not untrue, not impossible, merely inconvenient. Hargreaves turned to the ledger again. "The first payment coincides with this letter, and the amounts rise gradually over the years." "To whom?" Lionel demanded, voice cracking. "If these letters are from E, and the ledger shows E.H., coincidence," Miss Harrow cut in sharply. "I lived in this house. I handled correspondence. If Adela chose to record matters cryptically, that was her habit." "And the larger sum last Tuesday?" Hargreaves asked. A pause. Miss Harrow did not immediately respond. Dr. Pritchard stepped forward. "Mrs. Wincroft came to see me that morning," he said carefully. "She was agitated. Her heart condition had worsened." Lionel stared at him. You told me it was stable." "It was, until it was not." The doctor's tone tightened. Miss Marple folded her hands more neatly in her lap. "Agitation, a larger payment, a letter threatening speech, and then a sudden heart failure before dusk." "Was she frightened?" Miss Marple asked gently. Dr. Pritchard hesitated. "She was resolved." "Resolved?" Lionel echoed. "Yes, as if she had decided something unpleasant but necessary." Miss Harrow's eyes flickered toward the doctor, swift and searching. Hargreaves examined the remaining letters. The pattern held demands veiled as reminders, references to an arrangement, increasing pressure. The final letter, dated the previous Friday, was shortest of all. "Tuesday, or I speak." Nothing more. The date aligned precisely with the last, largest entry in the ledger. Lionel sank into a chair. "She paid, and then she died." "Convenient," murmured Mrs. Finch before she could restrain herself. Miss Harrow rounded on her. "How dare you!" But her indignation lacked force. It flared too quickly, then faded. Constable Hargreaves closed the ledger with deliberate care. "We must consider whether Mrs. Wincroft's death was as natural as believed." A collective intake of breath followed. Dr. Pritchard stiffened. "Are you suggesting negligence? I signed the certificate myself." "No one suggests anything yet," Hargreaves replied. "But a post-mortem may now be prudent." Lionel looked stricken. "Disturb her again, after today?" Miss Marple spoke softly. "If she feared exposure, Mr. Wincroft, she may have feared something else as well." All eyes turned to her. "Fear can strain a weak heart," she continued mildly. But fear can also be induced." The implication settled like frost. Miss Harrow drew herself up. "This is grotesque. Adela confessed. She wrote it plainly. Why are we seeking another culprit when she has named herself?" "Because she did not name the crime," Miss Marple replied. "Only that she chose it knowingly." Dr. Pritchard's gaze flickered once more toward the ledger. Hargreaves straightened. Until we understand the nature of this so-called arrangement, we cannot accept that confession at face value." Outside, the villagers' whispering had grown into a low hum. News travelled swiftly in Little Witchcombe. By evening, every hearth would carry speculation. Miss Marple rose at last, smoothing her gloves. "Constable, might I suggest you inquire discreetly into the quarry accident 6 years ago? Do so perhaps also into who benefited most from Mrs. Wincroft's continued silence?" Lionel looked bewildered. "Benefited? From what?" Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "From whatever it was that required 6 years of payments." Miss Harrow's fingers tightened again, that same whitening of knuckles Miss Marple had observed before. Dr. Pritchard moved toward the door. "I must return to my surgery," he said. "Patients cannot be neglected." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. As he left, she watched the set of his shoulders, too rigid for mere professional inconvenience. The house no longer felt orderly. It felt staged, like a room after a play has ended, but before the props are cleared away. A confession at a funeral was dramatic, certainly. But drama, Miss Marple knew, often served to direct attention precisely where it ought not to rest. And somewhere, in the quiet calculations of the living, she sensed that Adela Wincroft's final act had been less a confession and more a warning. The suggestion of a post-mortem lingered in the morning room long after Dr. Pritchard's departure. It altered the air as though a window had been opened onto something colder and far less controllable. Constable Hargreaves, sensing resistance building like pressure in a sealed jar, cleared his throat again. "I shall consult the superintendent at once. Given the contents of these letters, it would be remiss not to." Lionel Wincroft looked dazed. "But if Adela confessed—" "She confessed to intent," Miss Marple said gently. "Not to method." Miss Harrow's gaze flicked toward her, sharp as a blade's edge. "Aunt, you speak as though she were murdered." "I speak only of possibilities," Miss Marple replied. "Possibilities have a habit of clarifying themselves when treated patiently." Mrs. Finch, who had drifted nearer the doorway to overhear any fresh development, leaned in eagerly. "Everyone knew there was something queer about the quarry accident," she offered. "Poor Clara fell from a path she'd walked since childhood." Lionel turned on her. "My sister was careless." "Clara was never careless," Mrs. Finch insisted. "She was reckless, perhaps. Not careless." Miss Marple's eyes softened thoughtfully. Reckless and careless were often confused, yet they were quite distinct. Hargreaves gathered the letters and ledger into a leather folder. "Until further notice, these will remain in police custody." Miss Harrow stiffened. "You cannot simply remove private documents." "I can," he said evenly, "when they relate to a potential crime." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing more. The small assembly gradually dispersed. Mrs. Finch hurried out, no doubt to begin distributing carefully embroidered versions of events. Lionel retreated upstairs, claiming fatigue. Only Miss Harrow remained in the morning room, standing before the escritoire, as though guarding it from further indignity. Miss Marple lingered by the window. "You were very devoted to Mrs. Wincroft," she said after a moment. "I was practical," Miss Harrow replied. "Devotion is a sentimental word." "Practicality can be a form of devotion," Miss Marple observed mildly. Miss Harrow's composure faltered by the smallest degree. "See, Adela depended on me." "And you on her?" The question settled between them. Miss Harrow gave a brittle laugh. "I had my independence." "Of course." Miss Marple's gaze drifted once more to the faint scratch near the drawer's keyhole. "Keys," she mused, "are curious things. They promise order, but they tempt intrusion." Miss Harrow's eyes followed her glance. "If you imply I tampered with that drawer—" "I imply nothing," Miss Marple said. "I merely observe that Wood remembers." For a fleeting instant, something like unease crossed Miss Harrow's face before she mastered it. "You are very observant, Miss Marple." One must be, Miss Marple replied. Village life depends upon it. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to thin. By the time Miss Marple reached her cottage, twilight had settled gently over Little Witchcombe. As yet the village did not feel peaceful. Curtains twitched, conversations paused as she passed. She found Constable Hargreaves waiting at her gate. "I hoped you might spare a moment," he said. "You have a way of noticing what others miss." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is kind of you." He lowered his voice. "The superintendent agrees. There will be a post-mortem tomorrow morning." Quietly. "And Dr. Pritchard?" "He will be informed, naturally." Miss Marple inclined her head. "That may prove instructive." Hargreaves hesitated. "Do you truly believe Mrs. Wincroft was killed?" "I believe," Miss Marple said slowly, "that she feared something enough to orchestrate a confession dramatic enough to distract us all." Distract from what? From the fact that someone else had far more to lose. Hargreaves frowned. "The payments suggest blackmail." "Yes, but blackmail presumes knowledge." "Knowledge of what?" He was silent. Miss Marple continued gently. "Clara's accident, perhaps. If Clara's death was not accidental and Adela knew it, she might have felt responsible. Or protective." "Protective of whom?" Miss Marple's gaze lifted toward the darkening sky. "That is precisely the question." A sharp knock echoed from the lane behind them. Both turned. Dr. Pritchard stood there, hatless despite the chill, his expression strained. "I was told," he said tightly, "that you are recommending an examination." "It has been decided," Hargreaves replied. The doctor's jaw clenched. "There is no need. Mrs. Wincroft's heart was compromised. The strain of today's revelations alone would have been fatal." "But the revelations occurred after her death," Miss Marple observed softly. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment the mask slipped. Not fear, no, something more complex. Calculation intertwined with urgency. "She was agitated on Tuesday," he insisted. "If she made a payment that day, perhaps it distressed her." "Or relieved her," Miss Marple said. He stared at her. "Relief," she continued gently, "can be profound, particularly when one believes a long ordeal has ended." Hargreaves shifted. "The matter will proceed as arranged, Doctor." Pritchard exhaled slowly, mastering himself. "Very well, but I warn you, digging into old tragedies will not restore the dead." "No," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "No, but it may explain the living." The doctor inclined his head stiffly and departed into the deepening dusk. Miss Marple watched until his figure disappeared beyond the hedgerow. "He's afraid of something," Hargreaves murmured. "Yes," she said thoughtfully, "but not of guilt alone." The village clock chimed 6. Somewhere, a door closed too quickly. Somewhere else, a light flickered on behind drawn curtains. Miss Marple folded her hands before her. "Tomorrow will be illuminating," she said softly. For in the quiet spaces between confession and revelation, truth had begun to stir, and someone in Little Witchcombe was already feeling the tremor beneath their feet. Morning arrived in Little Witchcombe with a pale, colorless sky, and a stillness that felt expectant rather than peaceful. Their word of the impending post-mortem had not been officially announced, yet it had traveled, as such things always did, along invisible threads of intuition and inference. Curtains twitched earlier than usual. The butcher paused mid-cleaver to exchange quiet speculation. Even the sparrows seemed to quarrel more sharply along the hedgerows. Miss Marple took her tea by the window, her thoughts moving with the same unhurried precision she applied to her knitting. A confession designed to distract. Payments spanning 6 years. A larger sum on Tuesday, and a doctor who feared disturbance more than accusation. At 9:30, Constable Hargreaves passed her gate, offering a grave nod. The examination was to be conducted discreetly in the adjoining town, and under the supervision of the superintendent and a medical examiner unconnected to Little Witchcombe. Dr. Pritchard had been formally notified, but had not volunteered his presence. Miss Marple noted that omission carefully. By midday, the first tremor reached the village. Hargreaves appeared at her cottage once more, his expression altered. Not triumphant, not alarmed, but sharpened. "There was digitalis," he said quietly. Miss Marple set down her teacup without a clatter. "In what quantity?" "Enough to stop a compromised heart, not enough to arouse suspicion without testing." She nodded slowly. Digitalis, in measured doses, could steady an ailing pulse. In excess, it silenced it. "Was Mrs. Wincroft prescribed it?" she asked. "Yes, by Dr. Pritchard, carefully regulated." "And the dosage?" "Within normal range. At least, as according to his records." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Records may be tidy." Hargreaves exhaled. "The examiner believes the final dose was excessive, administered within hours of death." "Administered," Miss Marple repeated gently. "Not self-inflicted." "No indication she took it herself. The concentration suggests it was dissolved in liquid." "Tea," Miss Marple thought. Adela's untouched second cup. "Who prepared her tea that afternoon?" she asked. Hargreaves did not hesitate. "Miss Harrow." The name settled heavily. "And who was present?" Lionel was in his study. Dr. Pritchard had called earlier but left before tea. Miss Marple considered this carefully. And the larger payment on Tuesday?" "Withdrawn in cash that morning." "Delivered to whom?" "We do not yet know." Miss Marple rose and moved toward the small escritoire in her own sitting room. From a drawer she withdrew a faded parish bulletin dated 6 years prior. "Constable," she said softly, "remind me, who discovered Clara Wincroft's body at the quarry?" Hargreaves frowned. "Dr. Pritchard. He was cycling past." "And Miss Harrow?" "She had accompanied Clara earlier that day, I believe." "They quarreled." Miss Marple nodded. The pattern was tightening. If Clara's death was not accidental, she murmured, and Adela knew or suspected as much. She may have chosen silence to protect someone, but silence breeds leverage. "Blackmail," Hargreaves said grimly. "Yes. Yet blackmail requires proof, something tangible." "The letters," he offered. "And the letters show pressure," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Not evidence." A knock interrupted them. Lionel Wincroft stood on the threshold, his face grey with exhaustion. "They are saying it was poison," he said hoarsely. "Is it true?" Hargreaves met his gaze. "There were irregularities." Lionel swayed slightly. "Adela would never have harmed herself." "No," Miss Marple agreed softly. "I do not believe she would." He looked at her, desperation breaking through bewilderment. "Then who?" Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "Who stood to gain from her death, Mr. Wincroft?" He flinched. "I gain nothing." "Freedom from payment," Hargreaves suggested carefully. Lionel stared. "The money was hers. I had no control over it." "And Miss Harrow?" Miss Marple asked lightly. His expression changed, just briefly. A flicker of uncertainty. "She depended on Adela," he admitted. "Financially." 6 years is a long dependency," Miss Marple said. Before he could respond, hurried footsteps approached along the path. Mrs. Finch, flushed with exertion and excitement, burst through the gate without ceremony. "Miss Harrow is gone," she announced breathlessly. "Packed a case and taken the midday train." The three exchanged glances. "Did she leave word?" Hargreaves demanded. "Said she required rest after all this distress." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Flight, she reflected, was rarely restful. Hargreaves straightened. "I shall send a telegram to the next station." As he departed at once, Lionel sank into a chair, hands trembling anew. She would not, he began, then faltered. Miss Marple watched him quietly. You loved your wife, she said. Yes. And Miss Harrow? He closed his eyes. Silence answered more eloquently than speech. When he had gone, Miss Marple stood very still in her small sitting room. Digitalis in tea, a payment delivered, a companion departing abruptly. Yet something remained misaligned. If Miss Harrow had been the blackmailer, why continue the payments once Clara was dead, and why provoke a confession so theatrical it invited scrutiny? Outside, the village stirred with anxious curiosity. The tidy narrative of a self-confessed sin had fractured into something far more dangerous. Miss Marple returned to her window. Across the lane, Dr. Pritchard's surgery stood with its blinds drawn despite the afternoon light. He had discovered Clara's body. He had prescribed the digitalis. He had been present on Tuesday, and he had argued most forcefully against disturbing the past. Miss Marple folded her hands. Her expression mild once more. Someone had indeed felt relief at Adela Wincroft's death. The question was no longer who had been blackmailed. It was who had decided the payments must end, permanently. By late afternoon, the news of Miss Harrow's departure had spread as swiftly as the earlier rumor of poison. The village, which had awakened to suspicion, now settled into a more decisive judgment. Flight, in little Witchcomb's estimation, was perilously close to confession. Constable Hargreaves returned before dusk, boots dusted with the pale chalk of the station road. She boarded the 12:15 to Brenton, he reported to Miss Marple, who received him once more in her small sitting room. No attempt at disguise. No, she carried only one case. Did she purchase a return? Miss Marple asked mildly. No. Curious, she murmured. A guilty woman might flee further. A frightened one may hope distance alone will suffice. Hargreaves frowned. We've telegraphed ahead. She'll be asked to remain available for questioning. Miss Marple nodded but did not look reassured. And Dr. Pritchard? At his surgery all afternoon. Patients can confirm it. Patients rarely observe what they are not looking for, she replied gently. Hargreaves hesitated. You believe he administered the digitalis? I believe, she said carefully, that opportunity and knowledge are powerful allies. Dr. Pritchard possessed both. But Miss Harrow prepared the tea. Yes, and yet the digitalis must have been obtained. The prescription bottle was found on Mrs. at Wincroft's bedside table, Hargreaves said. Partially empty. More empty than it ought to have been? He met her eyes. Precisely. Miss Marple rose and moved toward her window. Across the lane, the surgery's blinds were still drawn, lending the modest building an air of secrecy. Constable, she said thoughtfully, did Mrs. Wincroft ever manage her own dosages? No. Dr. Pritchard adjusted them personally. He was most particular. Particularity, Miss Marple observed softly, can be either a virtue or a convenience. A knock sounded at her door before Hargreaves could reply. Lionel Wincroft entered, hat clutched tightly in both hands. They've taken her away, he said hoarsely. Emmeline, as though she were a criminal. No one has taken her anywhere, Hargreaves replied evenly. She left of her own accord. Lionel looked lost. She was with us 6 years. If she meant to harm Adela, why wait? Miss Marple regarded him carefully. That is an excellent question. He sank into the nearest chair. Adela and Clara quarreled bitterly the day before the accident, he said suddenly. Clara accused her of interfering, of ruining something. What sort of something? Miss Marple asked gently. Lionel swallowed. Clara wished to marry. Adela thought the man unsuitable. Dr. Pritchard? Hargreaves ventured. Lionel hesitated. Yes. The room grew still. He was newly arrived then, Lionel continued. Charming, attentive. Clara was infatuated. And Mrs. Wincroft? Miss Marple prompted. She disapproved. said his background was vague, that his references were insufficient. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened faintly. Yet he remained. Yes, after Clara's death he was sympathetic. To us all. Hargreaves shifted. If Clara discovered something damaging and threatened to expose it, Miss Marple finished quietly. Lionel looked between them, bewildered. Are you suggesting? I suggest only that motives often predate opportunity, Miss Marple replied. She moved to the small writing desk and retrieved the parish bulletin once more. Clara died in March, she murmured. The first letter demanding payment is dated that same month. Hargreaves's jaw tightened. If Dr. Pritchard's past was questionable and Clara uncovered it, then her death may have preserved more than one reputation, Miss Marple said. Lionel rose abruptly. But Adela's confession, she said she did it knowingly. Perhaps she believed she had, Miss Marple answered softly. If she felt responsible for Clara's death, if her opposition drove Clara to the quarry path, guilt might persuade her she was morally culpable. And someone could exploit that guilt, Hargreaves added grimly. Precisely. Lionel stared at them, horror dawning slowly. You think he blackmailed her? Miss Marple did not respond immediately. Instead, she considered the final letter. Tuesday, or I speak. If Dr. Pritchard feared exposure, she said at last, the larger payment on Tuesday may not have satisfied him. Why not? Hargreaves asked. Because Adela's tone suggests finality. She intended the ordeal to end. Lionel's voice trembled. She meant to stop paying. Very likely. And he may have concluded, Miss Marple said quietly, that a dead woman keeps no accounts. Silence descended heavily upon the small room. Outside, a cart rattled along the lane, ordinary life continuing its rhythm, unaware that its foundations had begun to crack. Hargreaves straightened slowly. If Clara's death was not accidental, and Dr. Pritchard stood to lose everything, then he possessed motive twice over, Miss Marple said. 6 years ago, and now. Lionel sank back, face ashen. But there is no proof. Not yet, Hargreaves agreed. Miss Marple folded her hands once more. Proof often reveals itself when one applies gentle pressure in precisely the right place. Hargreaves looked at her thoughtfully. You have something in mind? Perhaps, she said with a faint smile. Dr. Pritchard is a careful man. Careful men resent disorder. If confronted with a detail he believes concealed, he may betray himself. Lionel looked up sharply. Moss, what detail? Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the surgery once more. The quarry path, she said softly, and what truly occurred there 6 years ago. The evening shadows lengthened, stretching across the village green like quiet accusations. Somewhere behind drawn blinds, a man who had once discovered a body by chance now sat in deliberate stillness, and Miss Marple, patient as ever, prepared to disturb the past at last. The following morning broke with a brittle clarity that seemed almost deliberate. Frost clung to the hedgerows, outlining each twig with unforgiving precision. Miss Marple considered it appropriate. Truth, she reflected, preferred cold light. Constable Hargreaves arrived promptly after breakfast, his expression resolved. I've made inquiries, he said without preamble. About Dr. Pritchard's background. Miss Marple inclined her head. And? He practiced briefly in Manchester before coming here, left rather abruptly. There was no formal charge, but a patient's family raised concerns about irregular prescriptions. Digitalis? She asked quietly. Yes. Miss Marple folded her hands. And Clara? Hargreaves exhaled. Witnesses recall she argued with him 2 days before her fall, loudly, near the quarry path. About marriage? About trust. Miss Marple nodded slowly. If Clara threatened exposure, perhaps of past impropriety, he would have been cornered. And Mrs. Wencroft may have suspected, Hargreaves added. Suspected enough to feel responsible, Miss Marple corrected gently. Guilt is a most pliable instrument. Hargreaves hesitated. There is something else. The chemist in Brenton confirmed that, Doctor. And Pritchard collected an additional supply of digitalis last week. He claimed it was for an elderly patient. Was it? No record of such a patient. The pieces aligned with quiet inevitability. And Miss Harrow? Miss Marple asked. She remains in Brenton, as instructed. Insists she fled because she feared being scapegoated. Understandable, Miss Marple murmured. Hargreaves studied her. You do not believe she administered the poison? I believe she prepared the tea, Miss Marple said. But preparation and addition are not synonymous. He frowned. You think Pritchard had access to the cup? Was he not present that afternoon? Yes. He called to check on Mrs. Wincroft's agitation. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Then he may have had opportunity while the tea tray was unattended. Hargreaves nodded slowly. Lionel mentioned stepping out to fetch a document from his study. And Miss Harrow? In the kitchen, briefly. Miss Marple allowed a small silence to form. A moment alone is sufficient. Later that morning, she requested an appointment at the surgery. Dr. Pritchard received her in his consulting room, its polished instruments and tidy shelves projecting calm authority. Yet his composure seemed thinner than before. Miss Marple, he said, forcing civility, to what do I owe this visit? I find myself troubled, she replied gently, settling into the chair opposite him. About Clara. His expression stilled. She was impulsive, he said shortly. The path was treacherous. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Yet I understand you quarreled shortly before her fall. His jaw tightened. Village exaggeration. And the digitalis, she continued mildly. It is such a delicate medication. He stiffened. I prescribed it responsibly. Of course. And yet an additional supply was collected. For another patient. So I was told. A pity the chemist cannot recall the name. A flicker, brief but unmistakable, crossed his eyes. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her tone still mild. You see, Doctor, Mrs. Wincroft's confession suggested she did something knowingly. Perhaps she believed her opposition to your courtship drove Clara toward recklessness. Guilt can distort memory. He said nothing. But if Clara had instead discovered something troubling about your past, Miss Marple continued softly, her death might have served more than one purpose. His hands tightened on the edge of his desk. Now you are treading dangerous ground, he said quietly. Truth often lies beneath such ground, she replied. Silence expanded between them. Mrs. Wincroft intended to cease payment, Miss Marple went on. Her larger sum on Tuesday suggests finality. Perhaps she confronted you. His breath quickened, almost imperceptibly. You misjudge me, he said. Do I? She asked gently. Because when a man stands to lose both reputation and livelihood, desperation can become persuasive. He rose abruptly. This is outrageous. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, rising as well, it is curious that you oppose the post-mortem so vigorously. A long pause followed. You cannot prove anything, he said at last. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. Not yet. She turned toward the door, then paused. One more thing, she added lightly. The quarry path has been inspected again this morning. The constable tells me the old railing shows signs of deliberate weakening 6 years ago. The lie was delivered with perfect calm. Dr. Pritchard's reaction was instantaneous. Color drained from his face, his composure fractured. That is impossible, he said too quickly. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Impossible, she echoed softly. How can you be certain? He faltered. For a fleeting second, the mask slipped entirely, revealing fear, calculation, and the dawning realization that he had spoken too much. Miss Marple inclined her head politely and departed without further word. Outside, the frost had begun to melt, leaving dark patches upon the grass. Constable Hargreaves waited by the gate. "Well?" he asked quietly. "He knows," Miss Marple replied. "She knows what?" "That we are closer than he imagined." Hargreaves exhaled slowly. "Then it is only a matter of time." "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice calm as ever. "And when cornered, he may attempt one final act." As if summoned by the thought, a shout echoed from the direction of the village green. Both turned sharply. A figure was running, breathless, alarmed. "Doctor!" the voice cried. "There's been another accident at the quarry." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but in her eyes, certainty hardened. The past, it seemed, had refused to remain buried. The cry carried across the green with a sharpness that seemed to slice through the morning air. Villagers turned as one, conversations faltering mid-sentence. The young stable boy who had shouted stood bent double, gasping. "At the quarry," he managed. "Chance, someone's fallen." Constable Hargreaves reacted first, striding forward. Dr. Pritchard, who had emerged from his surgery at the commotion, hesitated only a fraction of a second before following, medical bag already in hand. Miss Marple did not hurry. She walked at a measured pace behind the gathering cluster of villagers, her eyes attentive not to the path, but to the faces around her. Fear, certainly. Curiosity, undeniably. But on one face, just briefly, she glimpsed something more complex. Dr. Pritchard's expression as he moved ahead was not merely alarmed. It was taut with recognition. The quarry path lay beyond the hedgerow, its chalky surface pale against the darker earth. The railing, weathered and modest, bordered the steep drop where Clara Wincroft had fallen 6 years earlier. Today, a small crowd had already formed at the edge. "Yes, it's Mrs. Finch," someone whispered. Mrs. Finch sat upon the ground, skirts muddied, clutching her ankle with theatrical despair. She looked far more indignant than injured. "I told them it was unsafe," she cried. "I nearly went over." Dr. Pritchard knelt beside her, efficient and controlled. "A sprain," he pronounced after a brief examination. "Nothing more." Constable Hargreaves moved toward the railing, studying it carefully. Miss Marple approached more slowly, her gaze resting upon the wood. It bore the marks of age and weather, but no fresh disturbance. "How did you come to slip, Mrs. Finch?" she asked gently. "I was walking," the woman replied indignantly, "merely observing, and the ground gave way." "The ground?" Hargreaves echoed. "Well, perhaps I misstepped," she amended quickly. But one cannot be too careful." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the stable boy. "And you?" she inquired softly. "Did you see Mrs. Finch fall?" He shook his head. "I heard her shout, that's all." A murmur rippled through the gathering. The accident, it seemed, was no accident at all, merely a stumble magnified by nerves. Yet the effect had been immediate. Dr. Pritchard had rushed to the quarry without hesitation. Miss Marple observed him now. His hands were steady as he wrapped Mrs. Finch's ankle, but a sheen of perspiration lingered at his temple despite the chill. "Curious," she remarked lightly to Constable Hargreaves. "How certain one can sound about impossibilities." Hargreaves followed her gaze to the railing. Earlier, in the consulting room, she had mentioned signs of deliberate weakening, a fabrication designed to test reaction. Pritchard's denial had been instinctive, too swift. Now, confronted with the sight once more, he avoided looking directly at the railing. Lionel Wincroft arrived breathless moments later, drawn by the commotion. He stared at the scene with visible distress. "This place should be closed," he muttered. "It has brought nothing but misery." "Perhaps it has preserved something as well," Miss Marple said quietly. He looked at her, uncomprehending. Constable Hargreaves straightened at last. "The railing is secure," he announced. "No signs of tampering." Dr. Pritchard rose slowly. "As I told you," he said, a trace of bitterness edging his tone. "Clara's fall was tragic, not criminal." Miss Marple regarded him with mild curiosity. "And yet you seemed quite certain it could not have been otherwise." His gaze hardened. "Because I examined the site myself." "Immediately after discovering her?" she asked gently. "Yes." "How fortunate," she murmured. A silence fell. Mrs. Finch, now assisted to her feet, looked between them with renewed interest. The quarry had once again become the center of attention. Miss Marple stepped closer to the railing. She ran her gloved fingers lightly along its surface. "Wood weathers evenly," she said conversationally, "unless disturbed." Hargreaves glanced at her. 6 years leave subtle traces," she continued. "A repaired joint, a replaced nail." Pritchard's composure tightened visibly. "You are speculating," he said sharply. "Am I?" she replied. Constable Hargreaves crouched, examining the lower post more closely. After a moment, he frowned. "There is a newer nail here," he said slowly. "And this section, slightly misaligned." Pritchard stepped back involuntarily. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. If a railing were weakened deliberately and later repaired to avoid suspicion, it might appear precisely so. "You have no proof," Pritchard repeated, though the certainty had drained from his tone. "Not yet," Hargreaves said quietly. The villagers sensed the shift. Their murmurs deepened. Miss Marple met Pritchard's eyes directly for the first time. "When Mrs. Wincroft threatened to end her payments, you faced exposure twice over," she said softly. "Clara's death and the digitalis." His jaw clenched. "You misjudge me," he insisted, but the words rang hollow. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Then perhaps you will not object to a closer inspection of this railing and of your past." For a moment, the doctor stood very still. Then, as though something within him fractured beyond repair, he turned abruptly and began walking away from the quarry path. "Doctor!" Hargreaves called sharply. He did not stop. The villagers parted uncertainly as he moved through them, his stride lengthening, composure unraveling. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression unchanged. "Cornered men seldom remain calm," she said quietly. Hargreaves signaled to the stable boy. "Fetch 2 constables. Quickly." The frost had melted entirely now, leaving the ground damp and treacherous. And as Dr. Pritchard's figure retreated toward the village, it was clear that the final reckoning was no longer a matter of speculation, but of pursuit. Dr. Pritchard did not run at first. He walked swiftly, shoulders rigid, medical bag swinging at his side. The villagers parted before him, uncertain whether they were witnessing indignation or retreat. Constable Hargreaves followed at a measured but unmistakably purposeful pace, the stable boy sprinting ahead to summon assistance. Miss Marple remained by the quarry path a moment longer, her gaze resting on the repaired section of railing. 6 years ago, a weakened joint, a quarrel, a fall, and afterward, a careful repair. Not panic, calculation. She turned back toward the village green just as voices rose in renewed agitation. Pritchard had reached the steps of his surgery when Hargreaves called again, sharper this time. "Doctor, I must ask you to remain." The words carried the weight of authority now. For a heartbeat, Pritchard stood motionless. Then he turned slowly. "This is harassment," he said, but the indignation lacked conviction. "Merely procedure," Hargreaves replied, "given recent developments." "Speculation and hysteria," Pritchard snapped. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, having drawn near without haste. "But hysteria rarely replaces a nail so neatly." His gaze flickered, anger flashing through fear. "You planted that doubt," he said to her in a low voice. "There was no inspection this morning." "No," she agreed calmly. "There was not." The admission seemed to strike him harder than denial might have done. "You lied," he breathed. "I observed," Miss Marple corrected softly. "You supplied the certainty." Hargreaves stepped forward. "Dr. Pritchard, I must ask you directly. Did you weaken that railing 6 years ago?" Silence pressed in from every side. The villagers held their breath. Pritchard's composure wavered visibly. "Clara was reckless," he said at last. "She threatened ruin over imagined slights." "Imagined?" Lionel Wincroft's voice broke through the crowd. He had forced his way forward, face pale but resolute. "She accused you of falsifying your credentials." Pritchard's jaw tightened. "You had left Manchester under suspicion," Lionel continued, voice trembling yet determined. "Clara discovered it. She told Adela." A murmur rippled outward. Miss Marple watched the doctor closely. His denial did not come. Instead, his eyes darted briefly toward the quarry path, as though the memory lingered there in the chalk dust. "She confronted you," Miss Marple said quietly. "And in anger or fear, you weakened the railing, expecting only to frighten her." Pritchard's breathing grew uneven. "She would not relent," he muttered. The words hung in the air. Lionel stared. "You mean—" "I did not push her," Pritchard said sharply. "I merely ensured the path was less secure." A collective gasp followed. "And when she fell," Hargreaves pressed. "I was cycling nearby," he replied, voice hollow. "I heard the cry." Miss Marple's eyes remained steady. "You ensured you would discover her." He said nothing. The truth had surfaced, not with violence, but with the weary inevitability of something long suppressed. "And Mrs. Wincroft?" Hargreaves asked quietly. Pritchard's composure fractured entirely then. "She blamed herself," he said bitterly. "Believed her opposition drove Clara to distraction. I let her believe it. It simplified matters." "Until the letters," Miss Marple prompted. "I needed security," he snapped. "Reputation is everything. So a whisper of Manchester would have ended me." "So you blackmailed her?" Lionel said hoarsely. "Yes," Pritchard replied, defiance flaring briefly. "For 6 years." "And when she resolved to stop?" Hargreaves asked. A long pause. "She summoned me Tuesday," he said at last. "Said she would confess publicly. Said she would not continue living under shadow." Miss Marple's expression softened faintly. "Her letter. She intended it as atonement," he continued, voice unsteady. "But if she confessed, questions would follow. Clara's death would be re-examined." "And so would yours," Hargreaves said. Pritchard's gaze dropped. "I adjusted her dose," he whispered. "Just enough." "Administered in tea," Miss Marple said quietly. He nodded once. Lionel staggered back as though struck. "She trusted you," he said. Pritchard's voice was barely audible. Trust is naive." Hargreaves stepped forward decisively. "Dr. Edmund Pritchard, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Clara Wincroft and Adela Wincroft." The words carried cleanly across the green. Pritchard did not resist. The struggle had already left him. As the constable took his arm, the doctor's gaze drifted once more toward the quarry path, toward the railing that had first betrayed him. Miss Marple watched in silence as he was led away. The villagers began to murmur again, but the tone had changed. Speculation had given way to sober comprehension. Lionel remained standing, face ashen. "She meant to confess out of guilt," he murmured, "and it cost her life." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand upon his sleeve. "She sought to end deception," she said softly. "That required courage." He swallowed hard. As the police carriage arrived to convey Pritchard away, a fragile quiet settled over Little Witchcombe. The past, once disturbed, had yielded its truth, and in its wake The village stood altered, no longer sustained by tidy lies, but by the uncomfortable clarity of what had truly occurred upon that chalk-white path 6 years ago. The police carriage disappeared beyond the bend in the road, its wheels crunching softly over the frost-hardened gravel. Only when the sound had faded entirely did the villagers begin to disperse in earnest, their voices subdued now, stripped of earlier excitement. There would still be talk, of course. Little Witchcombe did not abandon conversation easily, but the tone had shifted from speculation to reckoning. Lionel Wincroft remained standing upon the green long after most had gone. He looked smaller somehow, how as though the revelations had reduced him. Miss Marple approached quietly. She believed she was to blame, he said without turning. For Clara. Yes, Miss Marple replied gently. She mistook influence for causation. She opposed the marriage fiercely, he continued. Clara accused her of controlling everything. The night before the accident, they quarreled terribly. And guilt settled where truth did not, Miss Marple said softly. Lionel's hands trembled faintly. If she had told me, if she had trusted me with the blackmail. She sought to protect you, Miss Marple interrupted kindly, and perhaps to preserve the memory of her sister without scandal. He closed his eyes. Instead, she preserved his freedom. For a time, Miss Marple said. They stood together in silence, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the village green. It felt thinner than before, less comforting. Behind them, Mrs. Finch lingered at a careful distance, already rehearsing how she might recount events without appearing indecorous. Even in tragedy, human habits endured. Constable Hargreaves returned briefly to ensure matters were settled. He has been taken to Brenton, he informed them. Formal charges will follow. And Miss Harrow? Lionel asked, voice uncertain. She will be cleared, Hargreaves replied. Her departure was unfortunate, but understandable. Miss Marple nodded. Fear can resemble guilt when viewed from afar. As the constable departed once more, Lionel turned to her fully. You suspected him from the beginning? Not from the beginning, she corrected gently. At first, I suspected human frailty, and then I observed human precision. The railing, he murmured. Yes, anger leaves marks, but repair leaves intent. He gave a hollow laugh. Adela always believed in tidiness. Indeed, Miss Marple said, which is why her confession troubled me. Lionel frowned faintly. She confessed to intention, Miss Marple continued, yet she provided no detail. It was theatrical, designed to draw attention. To herself. Yes, and away from inquiry. He stared at her. You think she suspected him? I believe she did, Miss Marple said quietly. Perhaps not fully, but enough. Then why not expose him directly? Miss Marple's gaze softened. Because certainty is a heavy burden. She may have feared being wrong, and she may have feared the damage exposure would bring to you, to the village, to Clara's memory. Lionel bowed his head. So she chose a dramatic confession, Miss Marple went on gently. Intending to accept moral blame, it was her way of closing accounts. And he chose to close them permanently, Lionel whispered. Yes. The church bell chimed softly in the distance, marking the hour. Its sound felt different now, less routine, more reflective. Over the following days, Little Witchcombe adjusted. Dr. Pritchard's surgery remained shuttered. Patients travelled to Brenton for care. Miss Harrow returned quietly after giving her statement, her composure subdued but intact. She visited Lionel once, briefly. Whatever passed between them remained private. Mrs. Finch discovered that even scandal could exhaust itself. Repetition dulled its edge. The quarry path was inspected thoroughly and declared safe. A sturdier railing was installed, its wood new and unweathered. The children were warned away, regardless. Miss Marple resumed her usual routines, knitting by the window, tending her small garden, listening when spoken to and observing when not. Yet the events lingered in her thoughts. One afternoon, Lionel called again. He carried a small envelope. "This was found among Adela's papers," he said quietly. "It was not in the drawer." Miss Marple accepted it. Inside lay a brief note, written in Adela's precise hand. "If I am wrong, may I be forgiven. If I am right, may the truth be kinder than silence." Miss Marple read it twice before returning it. "She knew more than she admitted," Lionel said. "She understood human nature," Miss Marple replied. "Including her own." He looked toward the window, where the village green lay calm beneath a pale sky. Will it ever feel as it did before?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "No," she said at last, "but that is not always misfortune." He glanced at her, puzzled. "Villages," she explained gently, "often rely upon comfortable illusions. When those illusions break, what remains may be smaller, but it is sturdier." Lionel absorbed this in silence. After he had gone, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. The afternoon light filtered softly through lace curtains. Across the lane, children's laughter rose, tentative at first, then freer. Truth had disturbed little Witchcombe, but it had also settled it. She resumed her knitting, needles clicking in steady rhythm. Confession, she reflected, was rarely about absolution. More often, it was about control, about shaping the story one left behind. And Adela Wincroft had attempted to do precisely that. Yet in the end, it was not the confession that endured. It was the quiet unraveling of deception, and the reminder that even in the gentlest villages, human nature could be as treacherous as any quarry path. In the weeks that followed Dr. Pritchard's arrest, little Witchcombe settled into a quieter rhythm, though the quiet was of a different quality than before. It was not ignorance, but awareness, a stillness that came after a storm when branches lay broken but the sky had cleared. The formal charges were announced without embellishment. Evidence of falsified credentials in Manchester surfaced swiftly once inquiries were properly directed. A former colleague, long reluctant to pursue scandal, now provided testimony regarding irregular prescriptions and a near-fatal overdose that had been quietly hushed. Clara Wincroft's death was reclassified pending trial. The repaired railing at the quarry, once an unnoticed detail, became a central exhibit. Yet it was not the legal proceedings that occupied Miss Marple's thoughts. It was Adela. One mild afternoon, she accepted Lionel Wincroft's invitation to tea. The morning room, once heavy with tension, felt changed, lighter though edged with absence. Miss Harrow was present as well, composed and subdued, her usual firmness tempered by reflection. "I have considered leaving," Miss Harrow said after a pause in conversation. "This village will never quite forget." "No village ever forgets," Miss Marple replied gently. "But it does learn to live alongside memory." Lionel stared into his cup. "Adela believed she was at fault," he said quietly. "Even after the blackmail began. She told me once that Clara's death was a consequence of stubbornness." "She meant her own," Miss Harrow said softly, surprising them both. "She felt she drove Clara toward defiance." Miss Marple nodded. "Guilt thrives where certainty is absent. Dr. Pritchard cultivated that uncertainty carefully." Lionel looked up. "You believe she suspected him?" "I believe she did," Miss Marple answered. "But suspicion without proof is a dangerous tool. Had she accused him openly and been mistaken, she would have destroyed an innocent man. She preferred to bear private guilt rather than risk public error." Miss Harrow's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "Then her confession was an attempt at control," Miss Marple finished softly. "She intended to confess to moral responsibility, not murder. She hoped to silence the blackmail by removing its leverage." Lionel's brow furrowed. "But she mentioned the drawer, the ledger." "Yes," Miss Marple said. She wished someone to look more closely to see what she could not fully prove. Miss Harrow drew in a slow breath. She trusted that someone would notice. Miss Marple offered a faint smile. Adela understood the village better than she admitted. She knew curiosity would do what direct accusation could not. Lionel leaned back, absorbing this. So her confession was not surrender. No, Miss Marple replied. It was strategy. Silence followed, but it was no longer strained. It carried a quiet recognition of Adela's complexity, her flaws and her courage interwoven. Outside, on the village green, lay peaceful beneath early spring sunlight. Children had returned to their games near the churchyard, though they avoided the quarry path with renewed respect. The new railing stood firm, unblemished by weather or deceit. As tea concluded, Lionel walked Miss Marple to the gate. "I misjudged her," he said quietly. "I thought her rigid, controlling." "She was both," Miss Marple replied gently, "and protective and afraid." He managed a faint, sad smile. "Human, in other words." "Precisely." When she returned to her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her familiar chair by the window. The village moved before her in its usual patterns, Mrs. Finch pausing to exchange restrained gossip, the postman making his rounds, Miss Harrow walking with deliberate dignity toward the high street. It would never be entirely the same, and the illusion of uncomplicated virtue had dissolved. Yet in its place stood something sturdier, understanding. The trial, when it came, would formalize what little Witchcombe already knew. Dr. Pritchard would answer for both deaths. Clara's fall would be named what it was, no accident, but an act born of fear and ambition. Adela's poisoning would stand as its final, desperate concealment. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the rhythm steady and assured. Human nature, she reflected, was rarely dramatic in its beginnings. It began with small compromises, a concealed credential, a softened truth, a resentment unaddressed. Given time, those compromises grew roots. Adela Wincroft had attempted to prune those roots with confession. She misjudged the depth of what lay beneath. Yet she had also trusted that truth, once stirred, would not rest. And a robin alighted on the garden fence, bright and untroubled. Life, as always, continued. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet breath of satisfaction, not triumph, but balance restored. Confession at one's own funeral was a bold gesture. It invited scrutiny, even scandal. But in Adela's case, it had accomplished precisely what she intended. It had drawn the village's gaze to the drawer, to the ledger, to the pattern. It had drawn attention to the right question. Who was most relieved? Now the answer was known. And in the calm that followed revelation, little Witchcombe returned to its routines. Not innocent, perhaps, but wiser. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the fading light, the sound as steady as her understanding. For in the end, justice had not arrived with spectacle or accusation. It had arrived, as it so often did, and through patience, through the quiet observation of what others overlooked, and through the simple recognition that even the gentlest village could conceal the gravest of human truths.